Good morning or good afternoon, students of Santa Fe. This is Mrs. Savell. I hope that you're having a great day. Today we're talking about relating fractions to decimals. So I started out with a place value chart. Once you remember your place value, relating fractions to decimals is going to be easy peasy, simple as pie. Okay, so remember your place value chart. We're mostly going to be talking about tenths and hundredths so that we can relate fractions to decimals. So let's just remember we have our ones place, we have our tenths place, and we have our hundredths place here. So in fourth grade, when we relate fractions to decimals, we mostly just are going to focus on the tenths place or the hundredths place, or both. So we can use whole numbers, but let's just break it down by looking at tenths and hundredths. So remember, these are tenths with a TH, hundredths with a TH. So I have some examples, of course. Mrs. Savell always loves to use examples. So fractions to decimals. First, we're going to start out by looking at how to relate tenths. So remember, for example, if you have a model and this whole square represents one whole, and you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 equal pieces, each one of these rows is a tenth. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out of 10 are shaded in. So how would we write that as a fraction? 6 out of 10, or 6 tenths. So we say 6 tenths for the fraction, and guess what? That's how you write the decimal. 0.6. So remember, wherever your last digit ends up, this is in the tenths place, so this would be 6 tenths. So you say the fraction and the decimal the same way. I mean, you can say 0 and 6 tenths, but this is basically just 6 tenths and 6 tenths. So when you're writing it as word form, 6 tenths. So you say it the same way every time, as a fraction, as a decimal, and in word form. So this is showing 6 tenths. Here's our other example. I have one whole and there's 10 equal sections, or 10 equal pieces. 2 of them are shaded in, so that means I have 2 out of 10 shaded in. 2 tenths. So how would I write that as a decimal? 2 tenths. We like to go ahead and fill in our 0. So 0 and 2 tenths is the same thing as 2 tenths. Word form, 2 tenths. So those are a couple of examples where we're looking at tenths. Next, let's look at examples of hundredths. So if you have this whole square represents one whole, and each one of these little squares, there's 100 on this whole, on one whole. There's 100 squares. Each row is 10. So you have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. So you have 100 squares. Just wanted to make sure you knew I was telling the truth. There's 100 squares. So if I want to figure out how many squares there are shaded in, this whole row is 10, so I can count by tens. 10, 20, 30, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So there's 39 shaded in. So that fraction would be 39 hundredths. Now, how would I write my decimal? So remember, when you're writing, when you are saying or writing a decimal, if you're going to have your last, wherever your last digit ends up, that's what you're going to say. So we need the 9 to end in the hundredths place. So it would be, so 0 means not even this, not one, the whole thing is not shaded in. So there's 0, it's only a part of a whole. 3, 9. So 39 hundredths, because that 9 ends up in the hundredths place. And you would still say your word form, or write the word form just like you say 39 hundredths. 39 hundredths. So we're going to write that out. 39 hundredths. And I kind of say it funny because I want to make sure you can hear that TH. Hundredths. Got to really emphasize that so you don't think I'm saying hundreds. Okay, so let's look at one more example. This represents one whole. So we know the whole thing's not shaded in, so it's less than 1. It's 0 and. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54. So 54 out of 100. 54 hundredths. So if I'm going to write it as a decimal, that 4 needs to end up in the hundredths place, which is ones, tenths, hundredths. So I need to say 0, 5, 4. There's a decimal right there. 54 hundredths, or 0 and 54 hundredths. So I'm going to write this in word form. 54 and then hundredths. TH. So that's an example of hundredths. 2 examples of hundredths. So let's look at some other examples. So what if it gave me the word form and I needed to show it on my model, and I needed to write a fraction, and I needed to write a decimal. So this is really good practice. A shady story. Okay, so we have to shade in the model to show 5/10. So I know that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So if this whole thing is showing me tenths, because there's 10 there's 10 pieces, and so I'm going to need to shade in 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So my fraction would be 5 over 10, 5/10. My decimal would be 0.5. And that's 5/10. Why? Because that 5 is in the tenths place. So we say 5/10. Let's do 8/10. So I need 8 out of 10 shaded in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so see, 8/10 is pretty close to being equal to 1 whole. So 8/10 would be 8 over 10. 8/10, and the decimal would be 0.8 because now the 8 is in the tenths place. Let's continue on tenths over here. Okay, can you use whole numbers and fractions and decimals? Of course, you are going to see whole numbers sometimes. So this one is a good example. 1 3/10. 1 means one whole square will be shaded in. So let me do that. I'm going to try to do it neatly, but try not to take too much time. So the whole thing is shaded in. That's showing 1 3/10. This one is just going to be 3 out of 10. So 1, 2, 3. Now how do I write that over here as a fraction, and how do I write it as a decimal? Remember, we looked at our place value, ones, decimal, tenths, hundredths. So 1 is going to be a whole number, and then 3 out of 10 would just be next to it. So you're going to have your whole number bigger and then you write your fraction numbers smaller. It doesn't have to be exact, but that's basically what you need to do. Your whole number's bigger, and then just write a little bit smaller numbers and put your fraction next to it. So this is showing 1 3/10. So my 1 is in the ones place, my decimal, and my 3 would be like that, 1 3/10. So let's go down to hundredths. So I need 54 hundredths. Here is one whole, and each one of those little squares equals 100. 100th with a th, because like I showed you before, there's 100 squares that makes up one whole. So if I wanted to show on my model 54 hundredths, I need to shade in 54 squares. So I know each row is 10, so 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and then 4 more. 1, 2, 3, 4. So my fraction would be 54 over 100, and my decimal would be 0.54. Notice something to make sure you notice. See, 54, that 4 ends up in the hundredths place is why we say that decimal 54 hundredths. Notice what's in the tenths. 5 tenths. See, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Even though the squares are littler, it's still like one of these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's just something to notice. 5, there are 5 tenths, and then there's 4 hundredths. So just something that I wanted to throw in there. 54 hundredths. Okay, and then I want to skip over here to show a whole number and a fraction or decimal. So if we have 1 11 hundredths, that's saying that one whole square needs to be completely filled in. All of this. And what do you think that would be as a fraction, by the way? How would you write one whole as a fraction? Well, think about it. All of it is shaded in, and there's 100 squares. This is just something extra because I don't want you to get mixed up with this whole thing. But if you shaded in all of those squares, you have 100 shaded in, and there are 100. So keep that in mind. One whole is going to be equal to 100 out of 100. So anytime you see a fraction where the numerator and the denominator is the same, that equals 1 whole. Okay, that was just kind of something thrown in there. But let's go back to 1 and 11 hundredths. Now we need 11 hundredths. So I know if 1 whole row is 10, plus 1 is going to be 11. So that would show 1 as our whole number here, and then 11 over 100. So that's how we would write it. This is called a mixed number. You have a whole number and a fraction. 1 and 11 hundredths. And as our decimal, 1 in the ones place, decimal, 11 hundredths. Okay, so that's our example of decimals to fractions. I wanted to look at one more page because you do need to make sure you understand that it doesn't just have to be, like, you can have just fractions or decimals with no whole numbers, but you can always have whole numbers too that go with it, and it doesn't just have to be in the ones place. I mean, it can go higher and higher and higher, but still have a fraction of a whole or a decimal of a whole, a part of a whole. So I'm just going to kind of skip around on here because we kind of did this already, but let's look at just an example of a whole number and a decimal or fraction with tenths. Okay, so let's go here. So what if it said 3 and 1/10? So that means we would need 3. Okay, first we're going to do the fraction. So 3 is my whole number and 1/10. Then I would write 1/10 next to the 3. And if I wrote that as a decimal, 3 decimal 1. So we say the word form, the fraction, and the decimal the same way. It's consistent. That's how math is. That's why I like math. 3 and 1/10 is the same way we would say this. 3 and 1/10 is the same way we would say this. 3 and 1/10. Let's look at a one that has 100th. A whole number and hundredths. So let's skip down to here. 6 and 14 hundredths. So we have 6 is our whole number. 14 out of 100 is 14 hundredths. 6 and 14 hundredths. 6 and 14 hundredths. Which would be as a decimal 6 decimal 1 4, because now the 4 is ending up in the hundredths place. So we would say 6 and 14 hundredths. So that's kind of some examples for how to relate fractions to decimals. So you're going to be working with tenths and hundredths. So I think that it's going to make sense to you the more you practice. You can have whole numbers with it, with your tenths and hundredths, or you might just see tenths and hundredths and you can convert them to a fraction or a decimal. But the nice thing about it is they're the same, whether when you're saying it word form, fraction, or decimal. You're going to say the same thing. You're going to write the same. Well, you're not going to write it the same way, but the way you say it is going to be the same way. So it's pretty cool when you are talking about fractions and decimals. Alright guys, have a great day, and I hope that you are understanding your fractions and decimals, and I will see you later. Bye.